Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
The brave new world enabled by the internet is both fascinating and worrying. A part of me regrets that I won't live to see the wonders of the metaverse 50 years from now, but a part of me also appreciates the highly local and disconnected world I grew up in, with just a handful of deep and meaningful relationships. That world is long gone. The challenge in the emerging world of digital and material abundance is how to lead a rich life without becoming addicted to its many toys that can cause serious long-term harm. How can we enrich our relationships with the important people in our lives, in our physical world, before we seek imagined rewards in the digital one? Joining me today is Anna Lembke, who is a psychiatrist and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic at Stanford University. She's a specialist in the opioid epidemic in the United States and author of Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, Why It's So Hard to Stop. Her recent book is called Dopamine Nation, which is about the relationship between pleasure and pain. She brings out this relationship through a number of case studies of various kinds of addiction and mental illness. Anna offers advice which is particularly useful to young people on how to avoid addiction and achieve a balance between your physical and virtual lives. Anna, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I am delighted to be here.
Anna, I'm fascinated by the subject of addiction and mental illness and how they're related, especially in the emerging world of more technology and virtual existence. I'm looking forward to learning more about this in the next hour, and I'm sure this is a topic that's of great interest to people all over the world. Before we begin, how did you find your way into this area?
Well, it happened really by accident. I would say that I was a reluctant psychiatrist, meaning that I went to medical school planning not to be a psychiatrist, probably because I just worried it was too close to home, so much mental illness in my family. I didn't feel I could do it dispassionately enough to be good at it, but realized anything else I chose, I was too dispassionate about, and that psychiatry was something I could be really passionate about because it is so fascinating and because I feel, a certain sense of mission around it, having seen the way that mental illness can really devastate people's lives, even in my own family. So then I became a psychiatrist who was very then reluctant to address addiction problems. Again, kind of a complicated story there of not having learned very much in medical school about addiction, and also just feeling like I didn't want to deal with those people, but then quickly discovering that I really wasn't a very good psychiatrist as long as I was ignoring substance use problems. And through a particular tragic case, realized I have to start paying attention to the problem of addiction. And when I did, lo and behold, I really liked the patients. I liked the work. When they got better, not only did they get better, but their families got better. So I've really, immersed myself in this aspect of mental health and have found it to be incredibly rewarding and endlessly interesting.
So let's start with the definition of addiction. What is it and what are the major classes of addiction? And by classes, I mean substance versus psychological and the drivers of addiction.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of different definitions of addiction, but all of them converge on the basic idea that addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. Other definitions of addiction that I've heard that I think are also compelling are addictions are the things that I do that I lie about. The 3 C's of addiction broadly defines the sort of psychiatric criteria, which are control, compulsions, and consequences. And that sort of wraps it up into sort of a nice little memorable, a nutshell, I guess. Out of control use, compulsive use, meaning that there's automaticity to it, and continued use despite consequences are other ways to sort of describe it. Tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal are usually part of addiction. Tolerance means needing more and more of a substance or behavior over time to get the same effect. Dependence means that our bodies habituate in a biological way to that substance. And withdrawal is a classic syndrome of physical and psychological symptoms that occur when we decrease the dose of the substance or stop using it altogether. And in terms of the different types of addictions, they can broadly be categorized into substance use disorders. These are addictions that involve ingestion of some kind of substance into the body, and what we call behavioral or process addictions. These are addictions that do not involve ingesting something. They involve doing something like gambling, pornography, and compulsive masturbation, playing video games, being on social media.
Although in reading your book, I wondered whether it could go the other way as well, where, say, the endorphin rush you feel by plunging into an icy lake on a regular basis, or the pain in running a marathon, becomes something you crave psychologically on a regular basis. Can it go either way? Or is the physical addiction typically driven by something psychological?
I guess I would answer that by saying that I don't even really think in those dichotomous terms. I mean, the psychology is the physiology. The mind and body are connected. The universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and depression, as well as intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. So it's all physical. It's all physiological. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's how I would answer that. I'm not really, maybe you're getting at something else.
I was wondering whether there's a distinction between physical substance abuse, such as addiction to cigarettes and alcohol, versus behavioral addiction, which we seem to be seeing increasingly in the virtual world of the internet. Cigarette companies in the 60s routinely portrayed cigarette smokers as cool on yachts with super attractive mates. Arguably, kids got hooked early by wanting to be cool, not realizing that this coolness would lead to addiction. In the world of social media, the addiction seems to arise from a craving for reward or validation. For example, my colleague Jonathan Haidt points to the increased prevalence of depression and suicide among teen girls that followed soon after the introduction of the Facebook like button. There's no substance involved, but an addiction nevertheless, which is leading to potential long-term harm. I was just trying to distinguish between the two.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like what you're wondering about, or what you're getting at, is first of all the antecedents of even trying the drug. So why is it that somebody would try a cigarette or try social media, and that's clearly a complex social and psychological phenomenon, right? Why somebody, maybe because of peer pressure, or maybe because they just see other people doing it and decide that they want to do it. But I don't really draw, again, a distinction between substance addiction and process addictions, like addiction to social media. In both of those cases, the brain is impacted, and in my opinion, impacted in very similar ways. So the physical withdrawal that people can get from cigarettes also happens when people quit social media. And when they put their phones away, there's a real physiological phenomenon that occurs that can sometimes be experienced in the body and sometimes be experienced as psychological symptoms. It doesn't mean that every kind of use of these behaviors or substances is addictive use. And certainly with moderation, we can avoid the problem of addiction. But the impact on the reward pathway in the brain is really the same across all reinforcing substances and behaviors. I mean, what Jonathan Haidt is getting into is what are some of the psychological complexities, let's say with adolescent girls when they use social media, the ways in which it becomes this process of invidious comparisons between myself and these other people online. feeling bad about myself. Those are all important meta phenomena, but they're not actually, necessarily the primary driver of the problem of addiction. The problem of addiction is really, they're related, but the problem of addiction is really boils down to the ways in which something that makes us feel good in the moment and releases this chemical dopamine in the reward pathway is then adapted to by our brains by downregulating dopamine, not just at tonic baselines, but also below tonic baselines. And then when we're in a dopamine deficit state, that is the driver to do the behavior again, really separate from our joy necessarily of having done it or the meaning behind it. We set up a physiologic loop where when we're in a dopamine deficit state, there's an intense physiologic drive to repeat that behavior, independent of, again, how it necessarily continues to make us feel, because we can really not even like it and yet still be driven to do it. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think we're talking a little bit past each other in the sense that, again, the psychology is physical. These are all, circuits in the brain that get manipulated. Learning is, it's both a learning disorder and a disorder of homeostasis.
That's very useful, Anna. And maybe I'm conflating some things like reward pathways and withdrawal symptoms associated with different types of addictions. I was watching the series called Dope Sick, which is all about the debilitating impacts of OxyContin on millions of Americans, where we see severe physical withdrawal symptoms from opioid use, and comparing that to social media, where we don't see them quite as starkly. Perhaps you can come back to this later.
Let me just jump in there now and just sort of address that. So every drug has a unique withdrawal syndrome, okay? And opioid addiction has its very physical and physiologic unique withdrawal syndrome that consists of, diarrhea, vomiting, sweating, chills, flu-like symptoms. That's not the same withdrawal symptom that you would get from cannabis or from video games or from social media. So there are these differences in physiologic withdrawal symptoms that are different across substances. But again, I would contend that, and by the way, again, the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, what's universal across all these different substances is the psychological symptoms of withdrawal, the anxiety, the irritability, the insomnia. So with behavioral addictions like social media, gambling, sex, in fact, I have many patients who talk about physical withdrawal symptoms. You're right, not to the extent that people experience opioid withdrawal or severe alcohol withdrawal or Xanax withdrawal. Those withdrawals can actually be life-threatening physiologically, but patients will talk about a physical pain and discomfort after stopping video games, after stopping compulsive masturbation, as well as the intense psychological withdrawal, anxiety, depression, irritability, insomnia. Does that help clarify?
That makes a lot of sense, and thanks for that. One of the things you talk about in your book, and I've seen this mentioned in other parts of the literature, is to what extent is the uncertainty associated with the reward even more of an addiction than the substance itself, or the to sort of switch to the cyber world and social media, the like itself? How often do you see that as being the driver of addiction? There's just this sort of uncertainty associated with the outcome that is in itself addicting. And by the way, in my classes, one of the cases I sometimes use is, Harrah's Casino, and I take a rough poll and I say, how many of you think you're, compulsive gamblers? And typically it's about a fifth of my class say, I just can't help it. I just like that rush of going to the casino and the rush associated with the uncertainty. It's not the gambling itself, but just the uncertainty of the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So to what extent do you see that in your practice, where the uncertainty of the reward is more important?
Yeah, so here's where we're getting to the interesting inter-individual variability and how different people prefer different types of drugs. And I certainly do see people who really love the uncertainty, and that's what drives them. And gambling addiction has even been studied for that. Scientists have looked at the brains of people with gambling addiction and compared them to the brains of people without gambling addiction while engaging in a gambling task, and have been able to show that when they're winning, both the addicted gamblers and the non-addicted gamblers have an increase in dopamine. But interestingly, when they're losing, the addicted gamblers have an increase in dopamine while losing as well, whereas the non-addicted gamblers do not have an increase in dopamine while losing. And in addicted gamblers, the greatest dopamine elevation is seen at the moment of highest uncertainty. That is when the odds of winning and losing are exactly the same, which is fascinating and suggests that indeed those who are drawn to gambling addiction, for them, it's the uncertainty, that not knowing if the next roll of the die will be a winner or a loser, that is captivating for them. And I have patients who will tell me that it doesn't even really matter if they win or lose. What they want to be is in that headspace where everything else falls away and they're completely absorbed by the game, that state of non-being that allows them to forget everything else. But having said that, and of course, social media certainly has that kind of element that's so capricious and uncertain that, will people like this post? Will they, crucify me for this post? That can be an appealing part of it for some people. But I have many, many patients for whom that uncertainty is not part of the appeal. And in fact, what they're looking for is extreme certainty. What's appealing for them is knowing that when I take this drug, I know exactly how I'm going to feel right afterwards. I can control the way I feel moment to moment reliably, which is not something that can be said for the rest of my life. So it's interesting because I think, which speaks to why maybe some people get addicted to gambling and not alcohol, and vice versa. We all have, these reward pathways, but the wiring around them is just different enough that, what is appealing for one person may not be appealing for the next.
So do you actually see a difference between your patients that are addicted to gambling versus addicted to other substances? Are the gamblers also addicted to other substances, or is it typically just gambling?
Most often, people who are addicted to one substance are addicted to other substances as well, especially in younger generations. If you look at people in their sort of 60s and 70s who are addicted to alcohol, typically it's just alcohol. In younger generations, very uncommon to find somebody who just uses alcohol. People are polypharmacists. They use alcohol, they use cannabis, they use MDMA, they gamble, they use pornography. So it's partially a generational thing, which I think is highly affected by culture and access, just sheer increased access to all these substances and behaviors. I don't think really in terms of like temperament or sociodemographics, I can say that there's a consistent difference between people who are addicted to gambling or addicted to other substances. I just think it's, again, that kind of magic lock and key. Like when people find that drug that is like their drug for them, it's something very powerful that you feel, and then that's your preference.
So is this difference in addiction between the generations driven largely by their initial access to things? I mean, baby boomers grew up with alcohol and cannabis, whereas young people just grew up with access to more possibilities, including social media and games with social communities, and hence more ways of getting into trouble?
Yeah, so there are very interesting epidemiologic differences between the generations and also variations over time. For baby boomers, people now in their 60s and older, mainly what we see is alcohol and cannabis, as you said. But interestingly, especially for cannabis users, many of them used recreationally in moderation through most of their lives. But then when they get into their latter decades, find themselves getting addicted. And I understand that in a couple of ways. First, cannabis has gotten a lot more potent. than, the cannabis of the summer of love. So it just simply is more addictive. And baby boomers who have been using it recreationally are now, using the potent forms just like everybody else. And they're getting addicted because of that. I think the other reason is because a lot of them retire and find themselves with more time. And with more time, they're using more. And quantity really affects whether or not people get addicted. And then finally, there's the aging brain. The brain, which maybe was able to moderate over decades, suddenly finds itself less good at that. Just like our knees sort of give out and our hearts get less strong, it's also true that our brains get less resilient. So I see lots of baby boomers tipping over into serious cannabis and alcohol addictions when they weren't necessarily addicted younger, which is different from the typical story that you hear that if someone's going to be addicted, you're going to see it in adolescence or young adulthood. That's not true. We're seeing more and more people, including women, by the way, presenting in middle and later age who had been able to use in moderation and then slip into addiction. The big difference among millennials and Gen Zers is just the sheer polypharmacy, the huge kind of skipping around. One day it's one drug, the next day it's another drug. Almost always people have their preferred drug, their drug of choice, but they'll add it in with other drugs to overcome tolerance and increase potency. And then one of the most fascinating and also depressing epidemiologic changes is how many more women are now presenting with serious addictions. It used to be that, women to men, that men to women ratio of alcohol addiction was 5-1 to 2-1, also other addictions. And among millennials now, women are presenting with alcohol addictions at the same rate as men. So that's been a huge demographic shift as well.
So to what extent has COVID impacted addiction? By the way, the part of the motivation for this question is that I've now taught 2 cycles of students online and got kids and stepkids, and, they've also taken classes online. And sometimes what I hear is, half the people are smoking weed, while, although I couldn't imagine that they could possibly understand what I'm saying, under the influence. But, that's what I hear. And, I encourage people to show their faces and participate. Can't really force people to do that either.
No.
People have rights. You have to tread carefully. But what's COVID been like, both for baby boomers and younger people? Has it just increased consumption, compulsive consumption, and addiction across the board?
Well, not exactly. I mean, it's clear that we all started spending much more time online during COVID, the average person. And that even since quarantine is over, we're all now kind of adapted to being online more, and it's hard to go back. And there are lots of addictive digital products. So just simply by being online more, we're more inclined to try, the online digital products, whether it's a video game or watching YouTube or, pornography, exposing us all to this problem of compulsive overconsumption of these digital products. So that's certainly gone up. Even the average person will attest to that. We've seen a slight increase in alcohol consumption in the United States during quarantine, where people are drinking more alcohol than they were, and also drinking more days of the week. So I think, as people find that they don't have to get up and get dressed and commute to work, people are more inclined to sort of spread their alcohol consumption out over, more days of the week. I don't know the data on cannabis, but I wouldn't be surprised if, again, nationally it's gone up. In my patient population, what I can say that I've seen is opposite ends of a reaction to COVID. I've certainly seen people come into treatment who got addicted during COVID for the reasons that we've just been talking about. And I've seen people who have had long addiction in my practice who relapsed, and some even sadly who died of drug overdoses during COVID and quarantine. However, I've probably seen at least as many people get into recovery during COVID. For them, COVID was actually a time of less stress, less time out in the world, navigating the roads, commuting, all of the overstimulation, all of the triggers to use, grocery shopping, parties, all of that kind of went away. And for some people, it was like a huge relief, like all of a sudden all that noise stopped and they were able to calm down and focus and really get into good wellness practices. So I've seen both extremes.
That's interesting. So there's been a positive side to the virtual existence as well.
In my practice, absolutely, no doubt about it.
That's great. That's good to
Yeah.
know. So, following up on that question, to what extent do you see, and I'm going to sort of focus on sort of the online world, which is something that's, more interesting to me, only, for a number of reasons. I mean, we're just becoming more online all the time. It seems like that's an increasing part of our existence going forward. To what extent do you see our desire for certain kinds of online persona driving our reality in the physical world? There's this desire to portray ourselves a certain way in the online world. How is that driving who we are? In other words, this desire to sort of quote unquote seek audiences online. How is that changing us mentally and in terms of our physical world existence?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's problematic because, we already have a very narcissistic culture that emphasizes the achievements of the individuals over the group. And now we have an online culture that really rewards this kind of behavior, in which we're sort of all curators of, this persona that we put out into the world. And of course, we're seeking admiration and enhanced reputation and followers and likes, because that's just natural. It's natural to want to have people like us and regard us highly and say nice things. That feels good. It releases dopamine in the reward pathway, all of that good stuff. But it's a pretty dangerous pursuit because, first of all, it's happening on a very large scale. We're talking, thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of people. And so when that social media milieu becomes hostile, it can really be very, very devastating. And the fear of that happening, I think, leads people to not be truthful about what they really think or what they really feel or who they really are. And then that not being truthful online, I think, creates more and more distance between our authentic selves and the self that we're portraying to the world, which then contributes to this sense of a false self. Donald Winnicott, a famous psychoanalyst, talked about this idea of the false self, that sense of sort of not being real, depersonalization, derealization. And when we start to feel sort of not real and not tethered to the world, that's very anxiety provoking and very depressing. And many people who feel that kind of contemplate suicide, because if we're not real, then we're not really killing anything if we're ending our lives. The other thing too is just the inherent addictive potential and reinforcing nature of seeking out accolades from others. Tolerance leads to needing more and more of that over time. Now at first it was exciting to have 10 followers, but then I need 100 followers for that to feel good. And then that's not enough. And then I need 1,000. It never ends. No matter how much you get, it's ultimately never enough. So those are two real dangers I see with that evolution.
Do you think there's a correlation between people who have lots and lots of followers and their potential degree of addiction?
Well, I can tell you that a lot of my patients who have struggled with addiction to drugs and alcohol struggle with online media, their online media presence, and addiction to the medium itself, addiction to things online, addiction to social media. So, that propensity to get addicted displays itself wherever people go. This idea of cross addiction, once you try to give up one substance, you're very high likelihood of getting addicted to another substance or behavior, especially if you're not paying attention to that and not vigilant about it. Yes, this kind of addictive phenomenon is, I think, inherent in social media. These things, these products, these digital products are engineered to be addictive. They're all gamified, and the people who made them know exactly what will keep people engaged. They understand, our motivation circuits, and they prey on them.
I hadn't actually thought of this before, and this is maybe an interesting sort of PhD thesis topic. But what I was getting at is that are people who really have a lot of activity on social media, lots of followers, etc., are they actually likely to be more addictive personalities? In other words, is that addiction what caused them to seek it out and create this sort of online persona that is admired and adored, as opposed to doing something else? So do you think you'd find a correlation between, people who have like very high presence online and their degree of addiction and their craving for dopamine? I have no data or basis behind this, but I just threw this out as a potential hypothesis. And whether you see this at all, I mean, are a lot of your patients kind of really people who have lots of followers and presence online?
I would say that, if I had to generalize, I would say that many of my patients with severe addiction struggle to moderate their online use, whether they're making content and influencing people and have followers, or whether they're just passive consumers of the content available, which is another, probably even more common way, frankly, to be addicted to online products, is just to be passively consuming them. I do think, again, this is a stress vulnerability diathesis. These digital products are drugified. They're drugs. They work on the same reward pathway that drugs work on, and that people who are vulnerable to addiction will be vulnerable to addiction to digital products online. But I want to just emphasize, the whole drug of choice thing, and what makes modern life so tricky now when it comes to addiction is that there are so many different types of drugs, so many new drugs, so that you can be somebody who maybe has no propensity at all to get addicted to cannabis or alcohol or cocaine or methamphetamine. But it's possible that social media is your drug, and that human connection is your drug, and that these digital products have drugified that exact, lock and key that is for you, the one that's going to really send you down that rabbit hole. In which case, that really wouldn't hold up your hypothesis, because that would be a person who really would not have other addictions, but you give them social media and they're off and running. And I do think that is what is happening now, that we have lots of new drugs that didn't exist before that are broadening the net for the number of people who are going to get addicted, because, there were previously no drugs for people who were wired for a social media addiction or the kind of human connection addiction that these online products allow.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the things I had noted when I was reading your book, namely that prior to the internet and social media, we weren't even aware of all the possibilities out there of doing all kinds of things, whether it's drugs or sex or pain or whatever it is. I mean, we weren't even familiar. And then you go online and you say, oh, wow, I didn't know about that. That exists.
Yeah, and just knowing about it can prompt the urge to try it, right? And we see that all the time, especially among younger people, because younger people, they're actually wired to try new things, because that's adaptive, right? That's an age when you need to go out into the world and you need to, interface with your environment, and you need to meet people and find a mate and procreate and all that stuff. And then you introduce, an internet to that kind of brain wiring, and you get a very, very dangerous nexus of suggestibility, which I think is it's also wonderful, right? There's so much to learn about. There's so much to see. It's people connecting from opposite sides of the globe. So there are many wonderful things about it, but there's also this not so wonderful piece.
Indeed, a really dark side. That's something that really concerns me, is we're sort of going to inhabit a world in the future where access is virtually free and possibilities are endless. Then there are endless ways for us to get addicted and hang ourselves. So that is really
right. And your description troubling. Of, when you're teaching teachers are facing this all over the world, right? No matter how entertaining, interesting, erudite we are, we can't compete with a joint. We can't compete with TikTok. And, when classes are happening online and we are competing with TikTok, people are not going to be present, and they're not going to hear what we have to say. And they might be learning something, but it won't be learning what we're trying to teach them. And that's really challenging.
So let's segue into the challenge of arriving at the correct diagnosis of medical illness and addiction, both for the patient and the doctor, since pinpointing the problem can be challenging. To what extent do you have to be sort of your own doctor these days? And I'm going to relate this to something one of my previous guests, Danny Kahneman, was talking about, this notion of noise in human decision making. And the medical arena is, certainly not exempt from this as well. Doctors make mistakes all the time. Even when it's not knowable that someone has made a mistake, there's a very high degree of variance around decision making. That is, people presented with the same case will arrive at different conclusions. And, just this morning, I was reading a story by a former New York Times reporter about, his struggle with Lyme disease, again, which is something that there are lots and lots of theories around, nothing definitive. And, he goes to one doctor who says, well, no, you'd be cured with 3 weeks of doxy. And he goes to another who says, no, you'll need intravenous for a long period of time. And, he's in a dilemma. What should I do? And then, his response was, well, I had to sort of start listening to my own body. I had to sort of try and get more in touch with myself because, the doctor is doing the best they can. They're just telling me based on the symptoms what possible hypotheses it invokes. But at the end of the day, I've got to listen to myself. To what extent do you think that's true with your patients as well? Let's say they come to you, they're talking to you, they can describe a part of their lives to you, but they must always wonder whether you really understood their problem and their addiction, or whether they should listen to themselves instead. And that might even be, well, you're not really addicted. I started by asking you to define addiction, and it doesn't have a precise definition, right? Because even compulsive behavior, one might say, yeah, I'm compulsive sometimes, but I'm functioning okay. I've got an okay job. I seem to be doing fine. I'm not that sick. So how do you think about this?
Okay, great. So a lot to unpack there. Let's just start with this idea that we should listen to our own bodies. I absolutely 100% agree with that. And I think a couple trends in our culture and in our medicine, which are bad, are that number one, we're very disembodied now. We're spending so much time in our heads. We're not connected to our bodies. Many of us are moving very little at any point in the day, moving maybe not at all. We're all in our heads because we can be everything we need. We can get from the internet, so that we don't have to move, and so we don't move. And we're really disconnected. We don't any longer know how to read the signals. There are a lot of devices now that are being developed sort of to help us know what our heart rate and our blood pressure and our breathing rate, which on the one hand, I think, okay, that's maybe good because, people will pay more attention to their bodies. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of terrible. It's like we're now putting more technology between ourselves and just our own ability to sense our bodies, to take care of our bodies, to feel what we need in our bodies. The other thing I would say is that you should be a skeptical consumer of modern medicine, that doctors are clearly fallible, that the process of creating new drugs and other types of interventions are profit-driven. And in that process, the idea of actually helping people can go seriously awry. The opioid epidemic is prime example of that, with the overprescribing of prescription opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions that led to the opioid epidemic that we have today. So, if I can get my patients to a point where they don't need to see me anymore, then that's been a really successful intervention. And I do wish that people in a healthy and positive way relied less on doctors and more on their own bodies and their own wisdom. And obviously, prevention, taking care of themselves and not expecting that they can abuse their bodies and then go to see a doctor who will somehow magically be able to reverse that, because it's not possible, or many times not possible. Having said that, patients with addiction actually do lose the ability to objectively see true cause and effect. When we're chasing dopamine, we are not really good judges whether or not our consumption is good or bad. And that's often referred to as denial, which is an acronym, as one of my patients told me, for don't even know I am lying. But it's really kind of a split brain phenomenon where on the one hand, we're living out our addiction, and on the other hand, we're hiding it from ourselves and other people. There can be huge consequences that we not only don't acknowledge, but we literally don't see, which is why a period of abstinence away from that drug is so critical to be able to see true cause and effect and look back and see the true impact of our drug use. So at the same time that I believe people should, quote unquote, listen to their bodies, be skeptical consumers, find non-traditional pathways outside of traditional Western medicine, I'm all for that. I do think that when we're dealing with the problem of addiction, one of the things that it does require is a leap of faith. If not, to someone like me, maybe to a friend or a family member, when that person says, hey, you have a problem here, it may not feel like a problem when it really is a problem. So I hope that answers your question.
To what extent or how often do you get people to admit they're lying?
Oh, all the time. All the time. All the time. I mean, I learned about lying and truth-telling from my patients. I mean, I'm a liar. I've been a liar my whole life, just like everybody else. We all lie. We lie in small ways throughout the day to cover up little things that make us look selfish or greedy or lazy. Little white lies that we think, don't really matter, make us look better. We're wired to lie. What I've learned from my patients is that there's a cost. There's a cost to those little lies, and they accumulate over time, and they take a bite out of you. And so in the long run, it's much better not to lie, even about those little things. And I find that patients are grateful for a space where they can finally tell the truth. They're bursting with lies. Oh my gosh, overrun by lies, having difficulty keeping all the lies straight. So to be able to have a place where they can come and unburden their lies is good.
So do they readily tell you that they are lying about their addiction?
First of all, they lie to me. Okay.
Yeah,
so,
right.
And then the lies come out, like they tell the truth later. So again, everybody lies. My patients lie. I lie. We all lie. But if we make it a value and a goal to tell the truth, and we're vigilant about it, we set up a sort of like a liometer in our brains that tracks what we're doing, we can get a lot better at it, and it's worth the effort. But it doesn't mean that we're perfect, we're 100% successful. I try really hard now in my life not to lie. And I still occasionally find myself slipping, saying something that isn't 100% true. It's not 100% false, but it's not 100% true.
Is telling the truth a necessary condition to get better? I'm not talking about sufficient, and I want to talk about other conditions, but is telling the truth an essential part of getting better?
I've become convinced that it is. And I've learned that from my patients.
I should clarify. I don't mean telling you the truth, but being truthful with oneself.
Well, it's both. First of all, it's very hard to be truthful with ourselves when we're lying to other people, because essentially the way that we come to know the truth is often when we tell other people what we're doing, how we're spending our time, what we're thinking. If we don't tell other people, it remains in this inchoate place in our brains that's just simply not very real. So telling the truth to ourselves is entirely equal to telling the truth to other people. And I do believe that recovery from addiction requires what I call radical truth-telling, telling the truth about things large and small, even things disconnected with our addiction that seem immaterial. I also have come to believe that radical honesty is key to a life well lived, whether or not you have addiction. And I talk about in my book, some of the neuroscience behind that, and also just why I believe that's true. But certainly for recovery, I think it's essential.
So what are the other necessary conditions to get better, other than being honest with yourself?
Well, there are lots. I think having other healthier sources of dopamine is really important. Even if it's kind of modest rewards, and those usually come in the form of intangibles like making deep human connections with other people, having meaningful work, that gives us a sense of purpose in life, having a creative outlet where we can experience flow and non-being. These are all healthy and adaptive sources of dopamine. A strong social network of people in our lives to help support us and pick us up when we fall. That's really important.
A real social network, you mean?
Yeah, real people in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, basic subsistence health, access to, adequate mental health, housing, nutrition. I mean, all those things are sort of fundamental. Not being traumatized, not being abused, not being in some kind of insane, condition or life state that would just be, stressful on an ongoing basis without relief.
So let's talk about kicking the digital addiction. What advice, and I'll come back to Jonathan Haidt's concerns about, young teen girls who are at the highest risk of addiction and depression. What's your advice to young people, and especially to young girls, high school students, college students? What's your advice to them as to how to deal with all of these toys that are available to you in the digital world so easily and so cheaply?
Yeah, I mean, the advice I give is, pretty straightforward, although really hard to do. And that's digital detox. I recommend a fast from that addictive substance or app or device or whatever it is for a minimum of 30 days. Why 30 days? Because that's about the minimum amount of time it requires to reset reward pathways, to restore baseline homeostasis, to be able to take joy in other things, to not be constantly craving and in withdrawal, to improve the anxiety and the insomnia and the depression that is a result of the digital device use. And then after having done that, I'm kind of taking an inventory and saying, well, what was good about that? What was bad about that? What do I want to do now? Most people want to go back to using their, device of choice or their digital product of choice, but they want to use less and they want to use differently. So then it's about putting self-binding strategies in place. These are physical and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice. Essentially, what it amounts to is changing our immediate environment so that we have a little bit more of a pause button between wanting to use and actually being able to get the drug. It can be as simple as actually turning the device off before we put it away in our bag, so that to take it out again would require the additional 2 minutes to turn it on before re-engaging. Sometimes that something simple and little like that is just enough to help us, not re-engage. Setting specific limits beforehand, saying I'm only going to use this app on these days of the week for this amount of time, and really committing to that. Other things are, trying to enrich and enhance our non-digital lives, right? Part of what's happened is that we're all spending so much time online that the rest of our lives have literally become impoverished. So trying to enhance what we're doing in real life, getting together with real people in real life, being in our bodies, doing physical things in nature, things that don't require a device or this kind of online technology. And in fact, the technology detracts from the experience. So things like that, having people re-nourish the sort of digital, non-technological aspects of their lives. It takes a lot of discipline.
To what extent does sleep compete with our enhanced set of digital possibilities? The CEO of Netflix once famously remarked that Netflix's competition isn't Hulu or Amazon, but sleep.
Well, sleep is, of course, huge because we're all now, disconnected from the rhythms of the earth and our own sleep cycles, getting too little sleep, sleeping, going to bed later, sleeping in later, getting out of sync with other people. So sleep is really, really key, in making sure that, as I say to my patients, you need to go to bed when the sun goes down and you need to wake up when the sun gets up. It's not that complicated. And then you need to get out of bed and you need to go outside. You need sunlight. I mean, these seem like, such basic things that people should know them. But I can tell you that vast majority of my patients, it's news for them.
You mentioned limits. Let's come back to that and end with that. I know several people who've been addicted to alcohol, tobacco, and several of them have kicked the habit, but they can't consume anymore because they know if they go there, it's just going to be downhill quickly. So there's just no going there. It's 0 or 1.
Yeah.
Whereas with the digital world, we don't have that choice, right? We just need to engage. You can't just say, I'm just going to stop using my phone, or even I'm going to stop, some people do stop using social media. A couple of my friends have just closed their Facebook accounts and claim to be a lot happier for that decision.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we really can't exit the digital world completely, right? So there's no getting away from that. And so the only thing we can do is impose limits and maybe
Right.
some self-described rewards after which we consume. Is that sort of the best we can do in the digital world? Is basically honesty and limits, and after that you're kind of on your own. You got to be honest with yourself and set yourself some limits, set yourself some conditions for reward. Is that most of it?
Yeah, I think comparing the compulsive overconsumption problems we're all facing with digital products is very similar to the compulsive overconsumption problems many of us face with food. We can't go without food, right? We can't eliminate food from our lives. We need to eat to survive. And so people with food addictions or obesity or other food-related overconsumption problems, it's a very difficult world because there are lots of tempting products out there, and it's hard even to know sometimes what the food we're eating has in it. Even if I wanted to not eat sugar, for example, it's hard to avoid it. But, people manage to do it. They create these kinds of boundaries, these categories. I'm gluten-free, I'm vegan, I'm paleo, I'm, you name it. I'm doing veggie juice squeeze. It's a constant battle, but people are trying to figure it out. And I think that's exactly where we are with digital products. I have patients say, I can play this video game, but I sure as heck can't play that one because once I start playing that one, it's all over for me. Or, this app I deleted from my phone. I'll use this types of social media, but I can't be on Twitter, because it's just the kind of rapid nature and my own impulsivity and my own addictive behaviors. I can't do Twitter. I'll get into too much trouble. So I think it's, figuring out how to set limits. That's part of it. But it's also making the project of setting limits a project worth doing, something that is actually good to invest in and worth investing in and will benefit us and improve our lives and improve the lives of other people. I think this is what's very also missing from the conversation is that, a lot of people will be like, well, that's ridiculous, or what does it matter if I'm online 15, 16 hours a day or what have you. I think it's a project that's really worth doing and that we should talk about as something that all of us should consider and engage in. Because until we do the experiment to try to cut it out for a while or set limits, we don't really, again, see true cause and effect. The world is sensory rich and causal poor. And the iterative process of eating up so many hours in a day with being online, we don't see the impact of that until we're months, years, and maybe even decades down the road. And then what will we say when we look back at how we spent our lives? So I'd like the conversation to be about not just how to do it, but also the importance of doing it.
Well said. Well said. I hadn't actually realized the connection between sort of food addiction and digital addiction. That's an interesting connection, and you point to the process as being something really important as well. Any last words of advice to kids? I often ask educators and teachers, what advice they have for people who have their lives ahead of them.
Well, I guess I guess in closing, I could say, part of what we are seeking in these feel-good substances and behaviors is to basically escape ourselves. I think we all crave non-being or just not being in our own heads, not ruminating and having our constant thoughts. We want to kind of just not be for a while, right? So the question then becomes, well, how do we achieve that feeling and that need, without getting addicted? And what I would say is that instead of turning away from our lives and ourselves, instead of trying to escape our lives and ourselves, what we can do is the opposite and turn toward our lives and ourselves and dive deeply in and really immerse ourselves in the lives that we've been given, and in that way, kind of find non-being. So instead of shying away from, for example, the big questions, we can immerse ourselves in those questions. We don't have to distract ourselves. We can really care about those things and invest in them. We can invest in the things right around us, the problems right here and now that need to be solved, the people right here and now who are in our lives, instead of trying to escape and find better people or better things.
Well, Anna, thanks for that. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with the rest of the world. Anna Lembke, author of The Dopamine Nation. It's a really easy read, some really interesting, fascinating case studies she describes. So I highly recommend that. And again, thanks for being on the pod. Really appreciate it, Anna.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And thanks for making this time.